Hi, I'm Claudia Yaqubi, Roshan Associate Professor and Coordinator of Persian Studies at the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies at UNC-Chapel Hill. I am so pleased to be here with you today with a great lineup of presentations. As you might know, this symposium titled Revisiting Discourses of Love, Sex, and Desire in Modern Iran and Diaspora was to be held on March 28, 2020, but due to the spread of the coronavirus, we had to cancel it. Fortunately, we managed to reschedule it virtually, but now it is in a series of panels. So I hope you will join for all of these panels, which continue until October 3rd. And I definitely hope you will enjoy and maintain the same enthusiasm and participation virtually as you would in person. Please feel free to use the Q&A button on your screen to post your questions for the panelists. Our moderator will ask as many of those questions as possible from the speakers. Before I hand it to our moderator, I would like to thank the American Institute of Iranian Studies, UNC Persian Studies Program, the Department of Asian and Middle Eastern Studies, Duke UNC Consortium for Middle East Studies, the Center for the Study of Middle Eastern and Islamic Studies, Associate Dean of Arts and Sciences, Associate Dean of Global Affairs, the Department of English and Comparative Literature, History, Religious Studies, Women and Gender Studies, Geography, the Institute of the Arts and Humanities, Iranian Cultural Society of North Carolina, the Library Collections Horner Jarrahi Speaker Series, and the Countering Hate Initiative that have co-sponsored and made this event possible. Without further ado, I would like to hand it to our moderator of the day, Rustin Zarkar, the UNC Middle East and Islamic Studies librarian, to moderate today's panel titled Love and Desire Across Borders in Modern Iran and Diaspora. Rustin John, the floor is yours.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to our first panel, Love and Desire Across Borders in Modern Iran and Diaspora. I am here today with very talented scholars who will be presenting their papers. So first up, I will introduce our panelists as they are presenting their papers. So we will get to that in a bit, but before I wanted to do that, I just want to go over the format for today. We will have our panelists present their papers. It will be roughly 20 minutes long. And then after each panelist has presented, we will have the remainder of the time for a Q&A, as Claudia has mentioned. As you can see, there is a Q&A function. Please feel free to ask any question that you have for our panelists. And I request that you address the questions to the panelists, or if it's an open question to the panel in general, please say that this is open to all. So I'm hoping to be able to read your questions for these brilliant scholars and their very wonderful papers. And before I begin and to introduce our scholars, I would like to first say that as the Middle Eastern Islamic Studies librarian, this symposium has been really a fantastic thing to be a part of. And as part of the symposium and working with the UNC libraries and the Persian Studies program, we are actually giving out several awards for graduate students. And these awards are a part of the Ferdowsi Tusi Graduate Paper Award. And the fantastic thing is that two of our awardees are actually a part of this panel out of the four. And actually the four, if you see the two, in this lecture, I also recommend checking out the second panel for the other awardees as well. So before I mention our panelists, I would just like to give the titles and the awardees and mention the awardees. So the first is Mariam Zehtabi with her paper, Girls for Sale, The Politics of Child Marriage in Iran. Nassim Basiri, The Politics of Love in Iran, Implications of Religious Hypocrisy of Clerics in the Form of Temporary Marriages. And our last two, Leila Zonouzi and Ehsan Sheikhalharam, are presenting today. Leila's title for her paper is Integration in Diaspora, a study of interracial partnerships in Iranian diasporic literature. And Ehsan's is Crumbling of Spatial Boundaries and the Collapse of the Intimate Domain in Farhadi's Cinema. So I will begin by introducing our first speaker. Our first speaker is Leila Zonouzi, who is a PhD candidate in global studies at the University of California in Santa Barbara, or at Santa Barbara. And her dissertation research is a comparative diasporic study between Iran, Egypt, and Turkey, where she looks at securitization and its effects on the creation of diasporas. And her title, as I mentioned before, is Integration in Diaspora, a study of interracial partnerships in Iranian diasporic literature. So I will give the floor to Leila, and I look forward to everyone asking their questions during the chat. And we will, the floor is yours, Leila.
Thank you, Rustin. Thank you, Claudia and Emma, and really special thanks to UNC-Chapel Hill Persian Studies program. I'm so excited to be here, and let's get to it. I hope that I can easily share my screen with you and things won't be finicky. Okay, here we go. So as Rustin said, I'm going to talk about Integration in Diaspora, a study of interracial partnerships in Iranian diasporic literature for you. According to sociologist Milton Gordon, intermarriage can be considered a major indicator of assimilation in the migration experience. While the study of assimilation and acculturation have advanced significantly since Gordon's groundbreaking 1964 theorization, migrants' choice of friendship and marriage partners have remained pivotal in the study of integration to date still. Seeing as Iranians occupy a liminal racial identity, or what Maghbouleh calls racial hinge, the study of intermarriages and partnerships can offer valuable information about the ways Iranians view themselves or aspire to be viewed by the larger society. In this presentation, I will be analyzing relationships in diaspora within the Iranian diasporic literature through the novels Against Gravity, published in 2006 by Farnoosh Moshiri, Refuge, published 2017 by Dina Nayeri, and Call Me Zebra, published in 2018 by Azarine Vandervliet Ulumi. I argue that by portraying the relationships in these novels as interracial, these authors examine the issues of race and immigrant identity and illustrate that by entering a relationship with a white partner, Iranian diasporic persons demonstrate that they have or have the capability to fully integrate and acculturate in their host countries. Through the 60 or so Iranian diasporic novels and memoirs that I've read, the literature is mostly dominated by single mothers fleeing the revolutionary fervor or families migrating together. Rarely had literature reflected intermarriage. Yet in the post 9/11 publications, I'm noticing more characters having interracial partnerships and marriages. Granted, not all of them are happy partnerships, as the liminal identity of a migrant usually comes in the way of marital bliss. In these novels that interracial marriages are reflected, these partnerships have been between Iranian women and white European, or white American European men. So in this presentation, I analyze this theory on intermarriage, its implications, and the significance of interracial partnerships of Iranian women with white European men. Although the majority of the studies on migrants and intermarriage indicate that non-European, non-Christian migrants tend to marry within their ethnic groups, migration theorists argue that intermarriage with whites provides a clear signal that minority group members have adopted cultural patterns of the host or majority population, such as its language and customs, and that they have been absorbed both economically and politically into mainstream society. These are some of the sources that were related to intermarriage or international transnational marriages. So in general, the existing literature examines either Middle Eastern intermarriage and partnerships with European people or Latin American intermarriages within the United States. So within Europe, the theory overwhelmingly suggests that non-European, non-Christian migrants either marry within their diasporic communities or they find a spouse from their homeland regardless of the fact that they are first or second generation migrants. The theory shows that intermarriage is also dependent on education attainment of the partners and their economic predicaments. To these factors, I argue that we must add racial dynamic and racial identity as another determinant component. So what is the significance of portraying Iranian migrants marrying or entering an interracial partnership with white men? How do these representations perpetuate the obsession with a discourse of model minority? How can our community respond to xenophobic matters such as the Muslim ban through literature? And how do we analyze this phenomena while Iranian American community has been undergoing a browning process, as argued by Neda Maqbooleh, as opposed to becoming white and melting into the American mainstream? So these are some of the questions I was considering for this project. Meng and Gregory, in their 2005 article entitled Intermarriage and Economic Assimilation of Immigrants, argue that migrants who intermarry showcase three premia. The first premium is that they have a faster speed of assimilation, that migrants don't assimilation than migrants who don't intermarry. They have the linguistic and language proficiency to allow for a smoother partnership to exist. And three, that they have a faster rate of economic assimilation, by which they mean these migrants either already are or will rise to the upper echelons of the society. They conclude, in general, that migrants who are young, educated, have good English skills, have spent a longer period in their host country, and have no religious beliefs are more likely to intermarry. Migrants who are less likely to find partners or face greater competition for potential partners within their own ethnic or religious group also tend to intermarry more than other groups. Surveys show that intermarried full-time salary earners earn significantly higher than the earnings of endogamously married counterparts, which is truly fascinating. A 2011 study honed in on the intermarriage among Mexicans, Dominicans, and Cubans in the United States from a racial perspective, and it concluded that if intermarried, Hispanics who identified their race as white tended to marry non-Hispanic whites, while non-white Hispanics tend to marry other Hispanics with the same non-white racial tendency. So this shows that the racial identity of the migrant is as a key component to whether or not they do intermarry or not. This study argues that intermarriage depends on the migrant's nativity, age at arrival, language skills, educational attainment, and racial identification. So how can we talk about the Iranian American case using these existing theories? When considering the presence of Iranian Americans within their host country, namely the US, because that's my case country, it is essential to consider the role of the US media. To analyze the impact of Western media on identity formation in Iranian diasporans, we need to take into account the history of the US involvement in Iran and the Middle East, which has had direct implications for Iranians' image and in the Western world and the global North. Although most literature refers to 9/11 attacks as the moment where the fate of all Middle Eastern migrants changed and they were labeled as forever foreigners, for the Iranian American community, the history of hostility and tension has had a longer lifespan. Prior to the Islamic Revolution of 1979, Iranian rulers remained allies with Western powers, including the US. However, recurring U.S. intervention in the region, including in the Arab Middle East in support of Israel, as well as in Latin America and Vietnam, gave birth to a new generation of leftist Iranian intellectuals who then facilitated the revolution. After the 1979 revolution, hostility and suspicion between Iran and Western powers increased. The anti-imperialist ideology, the chanting of "down with the USA," and the hostage crisis when a number of students occupied U.S. embassy in Tehran and held American officials hostage for 444 days in 1980 were just some of the reasons why the cleft between the countries continued to grow. To make matters worse, in the post-9/11 world order, Middle Easterners began to be increasingly seen as terrorists, as others whom their legal whiteness was contested, and they felt as though they were becoming brown over time and were forever foreigners. Growing up, the Iranian hyphenated teenager was perpetually reminded that they were an outsider, an other. As Neda Maqboolah's observation of 1.5 and second generation Iranian Americans suggest, Iranian American youth are more inclined to consider themselves as people of color, unlike their parents' adamant belief that they are white as European Americans. Maqboolah's interviews also show that Iranian American youth are overwhelmingly bullied, as the outside world included majority white classmates who belittled them through visible markers of their physical appearances to draw on a racialized boundary. Some of these Iranian descent or Middle Eastern descent youth wish to distance themselves from being an immigrant and assert their American identity by referencing their legal citizenship, or in the case of my chosen novels, enter interracial partnerships. Within these circumstances, how can we analyze Meng and Gregory's intermarriage premia in the case of our protagonists? So as you can see, these are the three main novels that I will be discussing today. In Farhadi Moshiri's Against Gravity, published in 2006, the protagonist Roya flees Iran during the early years of the revolution, realizing that she has no place in her home country. She and her daughter move from country to country at the mercy of the UN refugee program and eventually settle in the United States. After a series of traumatic events, Roya marries an American man named Rick. Rick then becomes Roya's savior, and their marriage, the reason for why Roya believed she belonged to the United States. In Roya's words, "I trembled like a 5-year-old, only because Rick was here to protect me and hold me in his arms. I was a schoolgirl again. I had a father, and I was free to feel hurt and cry. Rick talked softly and tried to remind me of all the good things that were awaiting me." With Rick's help and his place of employment, the People's Aid Center, Roya receives financial aid to pursue her doctoral degree, attesting that her intermarriage led to a rise in her educational attainment and economic assimilation, not to mention that her degree also is evident of her linguistic skills. While Roya sees Rick as proof that she has made it through her migration journey with success, she is repeatedly exoticized in the eyes of her husband, Rick. Rick admits to himself, "I felt attracted to the small Persian woman more than I wanted to admit. But the most irresistible was not her small muscled body, but her enormous black eyes, which met my one eye many times and made me feel hooked or nailed to where I was. I felt trapped when she looked at me and had a near suffocating sensation. I didn't want this to happen to me. This was like sliding down a long, slippery thing that would lead me to nothing or everything. My heart raced. I was aroused and felt fearful like an adolescent. More than once, I had kissed her and then took off, deciding to avoid her." It seems that Rick wasn't attracted to a beautiful woman, but an exotic, different creature. In another instance, Rick once again praises Roya, but in the oddest of ways. And her accent was, of course, different, foreign. She was definitely interesting, very sexy in a unique way, in a way that many men do not appreciate. Upon reading this, one can't really help but wonder why indeed they have married. In the end, Roya seeks affirmation from Rick about their marriage. Rick, tell me you're 100% sure that we will remain married forever. Baby, I have no doubt about it, no doubt. I don't mean that you would leave me. What if I go crazy and leave you? You'll never leave me, baby, never. I have no doubt about it. I like the way you say, I have no doubt about it. Say it again. I have no doubt about it. I repeat it again and again sleepily. Here we see again how Roya sees her marriage as a guarantee and proof of her belonging and settling. Now, switching to the novel Refuge by Dina Nayeri, we read about Nilou's difficulty coping with and accepting her immigrant identity as she constantly battles with belonging and having a legitimate claim in her host country. Nilou is a professor at a university in the Netherlands and married to another scholar of French-American heritage. She had fled Iran with her mother, similar to Roya, and had gone through a raucous journey of asylum, landing in the United States and later deciding to settle in the Netherlands. While Nayeri does not linger on moments where Nilou feels like an outsider, she meticulously includes a few telling and factual references to the Netherlands' political sphere, which impacts the way Nilou carries herself. She references Geert Wilders, who is a deeply racist, anti-Islamic, and anti-immigration conservative party leader who wants her kind of people out of Holland, who has called the Quran a fascist book and Muhammad the devil. Islam is the Trojan horse in Europe, he once said. Wilders has also addressed Middle Easterners saying, "You will not make Netherlands home." Statements such as these force Nilou to reside in a constant state of liminality, where she believes the frail roots she has created in her host country can be taken away from her in an instant. Because of this, she continuously checks her legal documents and thinks to herself, 9 documents to entitle me a life. She carries around some of these documents in each backpack or purse to ensure her legitimacy and legality in her host country. In her first years in American schools, she is solely known for being that Middle Eastern kid. Because of this, Nilou has figured out the formula to finding safety here and recreating a sense of home. She needed 2 things, money and the air of being a real American. Yet this formula gives her nightmares in school about being exposed by her classmates for not knowing American slang or Western music, and that she is from that country that forces women into drabness, which then brings her shame and fear. While she claims her marrying Guillaume was simply because her pros and cons list resulted in him acquiring a higher number, it can be inferred from the fact that she sought to physically distance herself from her parents, her heritage, and Iranians, that she wanted to prove to herself that she was, in fact, assimilated. Yet her marital conflicts show that she could not escape her migrant identity. Nilou's choice of partner is quite telling, as she chose the person with the least similarity to her unstable refugee upbringing. His sheltered upbringing in New York and Provence promised respite from her own story, her ripped-up roots. She learned that Guy's parents still lived in the house where his father was born, and they traveled to the same French village every summer. We also see how their relationship enters conflict when they reference their heritage, yet reach equilibrium and solace when they both share their American and Americanized experiences. And that's how we understood each other, in conflicting conclusions drawn from thousands of tiny details that they observed together. All those French and Farsi things. They built their hybrid world in harmonious hues. What they share is America, the television characters and the jokes. Guillaume tries his best to make himself indivisible from Nilou's family, as he calls Nilou's mother quite often. Yet this only infuriated Nilou further, thinking that her mother could embarrass her and that her American cover would be blown. In this sense, Nilou's marriage to Guillaume is arguably a classic case of assimilation, where her relationship, in tandem to her legal documents, entitle her an assimilated life. Lastly, in Azijn van der Vlies Ulumi's Call Me Zebra, Zebra calls herself a citizen of the world and battles with belonging. She enters a complicated and tumultuous relationship with Ludo Bembo, an Italian expatriate who has settled in Catalonia. Being with Ludo makes Zebra commit to a place, to staying put, and to commit to a person, while her liminal diasporic self denies her of being content with stillness. When contemplating on her predicament, Zebra believes no one has ears large enough or patient enough to listen to an ill-omened person tell her story of their survival, of what it means to be crushed at the bottom of the pyramid of exile. I would have to bear the weight of my past alone. Although the novel is narrated through the eyes of Zebra, we see that Ludo then takes an active interest in her and tries his best to impress Zebra. In order for Ludo to show his affection towards Zebra, he begins learning Farsi. Instead of appreciating the effort, Zebra feels exoticized. The book Ludo is learning Farsi from is entitled Persian for Italian-Speaking People, a guide for a journey into the unknown. Upon seeing this book, Zebra bursts out that language is reserved for my mustached father. To what end are you, Ludo Bembo, an Italian subject expatriate to Spain, to Catalonia to be precise, employing it? What does the unknown have to do with Iran? Zebra does not want her partner to even try to understand her background and heritage. She just wants Ludo to move forward with her. She travels the world yet still feels incomplete. While apart, she longs for Ludo. Thinking that her mission in life is to one day return to Iran, she embarks on her journey to sail the pyramid of exile. Caught in a storm in the middle of the ocean, she imagines going back to Ludo, to remain in one place and to belong. She imagines Ludo waiting for her at the harbor once she survives the hurricane and anchors on land. This image symbolizes that through her association with Ludo, Zebra can warm up to the idea of assimilating to her host country eventually. So lastly, in this presentation, I argued that the Iranian diasporic novels have included interracial marriages and partnerships to showcase the Iranian diasporic people's ability to assimilate in their host countries. This assimilation process is apparent through the rise in their economic status, their language skills, and how they can successfully enter partnerships with native speakers of English, and association with their white partners, showing that they are capable of dissolving in the global North melting pot, regardless of how Iranian migrants have gone through the process of browning and othering. And lastly, thank you.
Thank you very much, Leila. And yes, I would like to introduce our second panelist, James Berry. James Berry is a research fellow at Deakin University in Australia. Berry is an anthropologist specializing in ethnic and religious identity in Iran. His monograph, Armenian Christians with Iran, was published through Cambridge University Press in 2019. Congratulations. He is presently expanding his research focus to Sunni Muslims in Iran and is currently working with the chair of Islamic Studies at the Alfred Deakin Institute. Berry's research has been published in Ethnic and Racial Studies, Third World Quarterly, Iranian Studies, and the British Journal of Middle East Studies. And James's paper today is entitled Intermarriage and Ethnic Boundaries in Iran. James, without further ado, please have the floor.
Thank you, Rustin. And firstly, I'd just like to thank everyone who's been involved so far in organising this event, Emma Harver and Angelica Strauss, but also, of course, to Professor Claudia Yaghoubi for putting this event together. I know it's been quite not an ordeal, but quite a heavy event to organise, considering how COVID has disrupted it. But I have to commend you for your hard work and also for being so adapting so well to this environment and creating these awesome seminars, which I feel very honoured to be part of. So thank you, Claudia. This paper, as Rustin mentioned, is about intermarriage, ethnic boundaries, and essentially crossing borders, I guess. It's building on some of the themes that Leila talked about in her presentation. Essentially, I'm looking at it more from the point of view of ethnicity, nationality, but asking similar questions about why is it a transgression? Why is intermarriage seen as a transgression in this context in specifically Armenian Christians in Iran who marry other Iranians who primarily are of Muslim background from various ethnic backgrounds. As some of you who are familiar with the Armenian language would know, the term that is colloquially used to describe Iranian Muslims amongst Armenians is Barsik, which means Persian. It doesn't have an ethnic connotation, not as far as I'm concerned, as far as I'm able to tell, but and it's something that actually has come out in literature as well. Claudia probably will be able to talk more of this, but Zoya Pirzad's novel, which I think is called One Day Before Easter, is in that there's an intermarriage, or there's a relationship between an Armenian woman in Tehran and a Muslim man, and they referred to him as the Barsik, and of course eventually she's saying no, he's a Turk, he's not Persian, and the parents answer, well, we call everyone Barsik. So whatever their ethnic group is, but I just wanted to make that clear. This paper I actually started working on it 2 years ago. I presented it 18 months ago, but I apologize. I have changed. I've had more time to work on it now, but I have to apologize because I have changed it a little bit because at that time I was going through, my father had recently passed away. I don't actually remember much of that, although I did, I think I did okay in that presentation. But so today I'm just going to talk a little bit more. I'm going to talk about a more developed form of this paper. And this is built on my own ethnographic research in Iran, as well as other interviews that have been done more recently by Iranian scholars that are available in Persian amongst Armenians who have married Iranian Muslims, as well as their partners and their children. This was particularly performed by a sociologist in Iran called Aylin Esmaili. And so I'm going to start with a quote. This is from an Armenian man who married an Iranian Muslim woman. Just to give you a context of him as an interviewee, he's very bitter at the Armenian community about the whole experience. In his marriage, after his marriage, he actually tried to become more Armenian than he had been before, become more involved in the community. He was rejected, of course. His name was sort of blackened from the community, but they wouldn't publish it in publications such as newspapers, for example, when he was involved in cultural groups. And this affected, of course, his relationship with his wife. And now he's the other way. He completely wants nothing to do with the Armenian community. But I'll just start with a quote. So, if I want to see my mother, before I go to our home, first I have to call and ask, can I come and see you or not? My mother often doesn't know what the response should be. On the one hand, she misses me. And on the other hand, the pressure of the Armenian community, due to my marriage, makes her unable to give a definite answer. So this quote from, as I said, an Armenian man who had married a non-Armenian woman, highlights two themes in the problem, or the way intermarriage is problematized by the Armenian community in Iran. It can lead to being disowned by the community, and this in turn leads to being disowned by your family. Now, while this paper is specifically about intermarriage between Iranian Armenians and Iranian Muslims, I want to cover it through two prisms, that of community and community boundaries, and that of kinship. Both are tied to questions of nationality and ethnicity, which I have been working on for several years, vis-a-vis Armenians in the diaspora, but also in Iran in particular. Now, one of the important points made in the literature on identity, particularly on nationalism, national identity and ethnicity, is that nationalism as an ideology cannot necessarily be the primary loyalty amongst the adherents. This is something that we would all take for granted. But this is because people's primary loyalties are to their immediate environments, their close relatives and friends. More often than not, all of our primary loyalties are to our family. So the whole proposition of choose your country over your family is never really made, only in extreme cases. So nationalism instead, and this is found in the writings of the Irish scholar Shinisha Malashevich and others, simply appropriates the narrative of family, appropriating kinship to the point where you are trained to think of your fellow nationals as your family. So this fictive kinship is what Benedict Anderson more than a generation ago described as the deep horizontal comradeship of the imagined community. Now, in the case of Armenians in Iran, some might argue, quite correctly, that their identity and their ideology that reinforces Armenian identity, or Haigaganutun and Armenianness, or Hayutun, this is not nationalism per se, because the people in question are citizens of Iran. That is their nation, their nationality. And this is true. But when I frame it in the discussion of nationalism, what I'm getting to is not that nationalism is necessarily a state-sponsored or promoted by the Republic of Armenia. And I'm not saying the loyalties of Armenians in Iran are towards the Republic of Armenia at all. So I'm not looking at it from that state-centric perspective, because quite simply, that's not how Armenian identity works anywhere. I'm not even limited to Armenian identity, but definitely not in the case of Iranian Armenians in Iran. I just wanted to be clear on that, because reviewers in the past have always wanted me to clarify that, and for very good reason, for ethical reasons more than anything else. So what instead I'm pointing to in Iran and elsewhere is how Armenians conceive of themselves as a nation. So Azk, this word Azk, and Azkagan, which literally means, translates to nation, but also has an ethnic connotation and a connotation of kinship and descent, common descent, which really dates, has origins in the pre-nationalism or pre-modern national identities of Armenians, which Anthony Smith and others have written about, Raznik Panasyan. So you see this also in Iran. We're talking about Azk. So David Yagobian, in his book on the Armenian community of Iran during the Pahlavi era, he noted that the Armenian scouts have a motto which is Atsus Azkis Yevharenikis. So for my God, for my nation, and for my fatherland, or for my homeland. Now, David Yagobian talked about this as being a very ambiguous motto, because it could be both Iran and both Armenia. The God could be the God of all Iranians or just of the Armenian church. Same with the nation, could be for all Iranians, or it could be the Armenian nation, and same with the homeland. However, for me, it's unequivocal. It's Azkis for my nation means for my ethnic group. Of course, I'm sure there are those who would debate that, but this really comes into what I'm trying to talk about as Azk and nationalism coming together. So Azk, the Armenian nation, or Azk, should be separated from the Iranian nationality in this discussion. I'm sorry I had to preamble so much with that, but I feel it's important to get that out of the way. And as has been established, both I've tried to establish in my own work, but also by other scholars such as Ehsan Saryan and countless others who have worked on the Armenian community of Iran, there is a strong tendency amongst mainstream organizations, both secular, such as Tashnak Sagan, but not Hamaz Kain and other groups, and also the religious hierarchy, as you would expect, to promote a kind of social separation from mainstream Iranian society, or more particularly Iranian Muslim society, in order to preserve Armenianness, Armenian culture, Armenian language. And this separation to this day is supported by the Iranian government. It's supported by the Islamic Republic along religious lines because of the religious ideology of the Iranian government. And although I want to add, of course, that the Pahlavis accommodated this as well, as did previous regimes in Iran. So the separateness of the recognized religious minorities, not just the Armenians, but also the other recognized groups, has been a constant theme. So it's not exclusive to the Armenian community. So I hope that that context makes sense. But I just wanted to talk about that context because this is the environment in which the separation, this is the environment of separation that Armenian nationalism or an Azk ideology can operate, where the community is separate, has their own schools, has their own clubs, their own church, their own environment, and a mentality to try and maintain cohesion within the group and not be concerned with the outside world. This environment also reinforces the nationalism at the kinship level, at the family level, through face-to-face interaction. Now, I just want to, of course, always clarify that I'm not speaking in generalizations here. There are movements in Iran amongst Armenians to be more involved in the mainstream Iranian community. Sometimes it's superficial, but more often than not, you find amongst, especially those who are more left-leaning, to be more inclined to be contributing to Iranian society. And as some of you may have read with Huri Berberian's work, there have been periods in time where the Armenian community at an organizational level has actually been quite open to being more involved directly in the development of Iran politically. Okay, so to keep going, we can continue this discussion by looking at how the Armenian community of Tehran is a collection of Armenian families. Now, this, of course, seems obvious. This is like any community. But the concept of community itself is important because it is a word that, for most of us, has positive connotations of belonging, cooperation, and togetherness. It also has an interesting etymology, at least the English word. I found this out recently from reading Dante, of all things. So, communitas and the related word civitas has had amongst more well-known meanings of community, the meaning, at least in medieval Latin, of a walled settlement or a gated community. A series of houses, a series of families living together in a walled settlement. Now, I'm not trying to make too much of this etymology, for after all, the Persian word jami'at and the Armenian word hamaik do not have that connotation or that etymology at all. But I think it's still important because it points to something about community that's often, not always, but is often left out of the discussion about the more negative connotations that can come with the word. That is the limits and boundaries of the community. So the walls are the boundaries of who belongs and who does not. And the walls are instruments of both safety, or they can be instruments of both safety, protecting people within the community, and of repression, that is coercing people to conform within the bounds of the walls of the community. Sometimes this can happen at the same time. I'm not saying that, of course, every community necessarily has this at all times, but I'm just, that's where I think the analogy of the walled settlement that comes from the Latin etymology of community is illuminating in this case. So when we're talking about boundaries and ethnic boundaries, of course, Frederick Barth comes to mind. And he, even though he wrote 50 years ago, he talks about something which I think has never really been resolved in discussions of ethnicity, is about the liminality of being between ethnic groups. And this happens in the case of Armenians who intermarry because they are kind of stuck in a liminal space. Now, as Barth said, with Southern Pathans can become Baluch, but Baluch cannot become Pathans. So too can Armenians in the Iranian context become Iranians. And of course, keeping in mind that in popular discourse, to be Armenian, to be Iranian means to be Muslim. So that's a synonym. It's not necessarily an absolute point, but I thought for those who are not familiar with it, I should point that out. Iranians can't become Armenians, and this has to do with the religious component of identity. So Rafi and others have written all throughout history, they've tried to make Armenians as a purely Christian group, particularly the Armenian Apostolic Church as a central point of identity. And leaving that church or leaving Christianity means ceasing to be Armenian. So conversion to Islam, of course, is obvious here. Now, under Iranian law, essentially when an Armenian marries a Muslim, they have to become Muslim. Now, if they're a man, they actually have to convert. If they're a woman, they don't have to, but that is because under Iranian law, which is based on traditional Islamic rules, a woman has to obey her husband anyway. I'm sort of paraphrasing here. So her conversion is not necessarily, it's sort of taken as de facto. Now, this is just moving along. The Armenian Apostolic Church, of course, does not accept converts, not in Iran or anywhere else, with a few exceptions. It conceives of itself as a national church. So their argument essentially is, if you're not through descent an Armenian, there are other churches available to you. So, for example, I couldn't, as an Irish background Australian, I couldn't convert to the Armenian church necessarily. But I'm sure some people would want me to. Yeah, they have this view that you can't convert from that religion to another. Anyway, moving along. So the church's own policies on baptism is not a rule that's limited to Iran alone. I just want to make that clear. Though it is emphasized by Iranian archbishops like the previous archbishop, who said it's impossible for intermarriage to happen in Iran. If an Armenian person and an Iranian woman or Iranian Muslim, want to marry, one of them has to convert, and we do not accept converts. But even within the Armenian community, of course, in Iran, there is like a hierarchy, or not a hierarchy, there is a competition for making sure that people are adhering to being Armenian. So this is not limited to intermarriage alone. I mean, you can take the word Ordad, that some of you may be familiar with, means foreigner or non-Armenian, but it could also mean, in some senses, un-Armenian. A friend of mine who was working in Isfahan, who was Armenian from Tehran, she found herself occasionally being called Ordad by the Jughsi Armenians, the Isfahan Armenians. Now, in this case, for those of you who are familiar with Iran and the Armenian community, the Isfahan community is quite insular in many ways, and quite determined to preserve their dialect and their way of being Armenian. But it was interesting in a way, because for her it was like, we're all Armenians here, but you're creating a hierarchy, and I'm not Armenian enough for you. And this is, found in many diaspora communities as well. Like even here in Australia, Turkish Armenians, Lebanese Armenians, and other people of other different national backgrounds, because of some differences in their attitudes towards language, for example, they sometimes argue about, you're not doing it the Armenian way, or the words you use are Turkish and not Armenian, and so forth. And even in Armenian, you've probably heard the word shurjbatai, which means a reversed or turned Armenian, or someone who is insufficiently Armenian. I think this emerged during the Soviet times. Soviet Armenians referred to Russified Armenians from other Soviet republics by this term. And also the concept of white genocide, assimilation again, through intermarriage or just assimilation, which in countries like Australia, the United States, also has a racial component of the whitening of the skin. But return to the case study. The community boundaries amongst the Armenian community mean that children of intermarriages never fully belong to either community. So even in the interviews with children of those who have of mixed marriages, they usually speak of themselves in terms of divided selves, fractionally divided selves. And I'll give you some quotes from two such examples. These are both adults who were the children of intermarriages, just to illuminate what I mean by divided selves or fraction selves. So this is a quote from one young man who had a bad experience. Basically, his parents enrolled him in an Armenian school. He was bullied because he had a non-Armenian mother. He was bullied for his mother in particular. He was constantly having his mother insulted by other students, which, insulting someone's mother in any culture is a good way of starting a fight. But for those of you who are familiar with more patriarchal societies, or some of the patriarchal rules that can be in some traditional societies, and Iran has these rules, of course, that is a very humiliating and hostile act to insult a male's female relatives. So this is how he described himself after that experience as an adult, reflecting on his childhood. I am more interested in Iranian identity, which means that I tend to Iran more. And I do not gravitate towards Armenian culture. I always get away from it, so I can't witness their bad behavior. Even in the future, I would never marry an Armenian person, and I will never transfer my Armenian culture and language to my child. Of course, all of this is due to the bad influences Armenians have had on me. In general, I am 70% Iranian and 30% Iranian Armenian. He actually said Iranian Armenian, not just Armenian. Now, this child, this guy, I've mentioned this before, sorry. He had a bad experience. The other interviewee, he never really had a bad experience with the Armenian community, but he also described himself, just as the previous speaker described himself, as 70% Iranian and 30% Iranian Armenian. He also spoke in fractions. So he said it this way: I love Armenians very much. Over the years, I have not had any problems with Armenians, and I will greet them wherever I encounter them. But if I don't know them, I prefer not to reveal my identity and the issue of the marriage between my mother and my father. Now, what he's saying here is if he comes across somebody, a stranger who he knows is Armenian, he'll talk to them in Armenian. That's what he meant. That's the context of it. But if he doesn't know them, or he doesn't really get to know them, he'll never tell them that he's from a mixed marriage, because he's afraid of prejudice. So even though he hasn't had a bad experience, he's aware of this. Then he says, my identity depends on my surroundings and on the social environments in which I am. But if I want to say at the current time, I consider myself 90% non-Armenian. So that distance to the Armenian community is important here, but also is the fractions he uses to describe his identity. So I just want to finish there by saying, I've just run out of time, I'm sorry. I just want to finish by saying that the fraction identity is an interesting approach because, I mean, Amin Malouf, a French philosopher and sociologist, has talked about this, that you can't separate identity into fractions, but here you have them doing that. And I wanted to sort of put a point here that this really has to relate to the way that the Armenian community, the boundaries, have positioned it, and also in mainstream Iranian society, as two separate entities. So you can be fractions. In fractions, you're never 100% Armenian or 100% Iranian if you're of a mixed marriage. Anyway, I apologize I had to speak so swiftly there, and I'm sorry if I went over time.
Thank you very much, James. And lastly, we have our final panelist, Ehsan Sheikhalharam. He is he is a teaching fellow in the Department of Religious Studies at UNC-Chapel Hill, holding master's degrees in architecture and religion. His work is concentrated around theories of space and sexuality. His research has been published in the American Academy of Religions Reading Religion, CLOG, Wit Press, Artheo, and ZEMCH. I'm not familiar with that publication. He has received recognitions from prestigious institutions, including the University of Miami, Dumbarton Oaks, and the Roshan Cultural Heritage Institute. Ehsan has served as a part-time faculty in architecture at the University of Miami and North Carolina State College of Design. He has also served as a guest critic at the Duke University. And so Ehsan's title is Crumbling of Spatial Boundaries and the Collapse of the Intimate Domain in Farhadi Cinema. Ehsan, looking forward to your talk.
Thank you, Rustin John, for the generous introduction. And thank you, everybody, for being here. Before I begin, I would like to again thank Professor Claudia Yagoubi for organizing this symposium. I want to also thank my advisor, Professor Ernst, who allows me to work on projects that are not directly aligned with my dissertation. Finally, it's an honor to be on this panel along wonderful people. So allow me to share my screen. If I can do that. 1 second. Apologies, it's very good. All right, so this should be it. You see my screen? All right. I have a few observations on Farhadi's Froushande and want to make a couple of points. Among other recognitions, The Salesman won the Academy Awards Best Foreign Language Film in 2017. This is Farhadi's second Academy Award. The question that guides me here is the following. Can a film say something about that which it is not allowed to say? Can Iranian cinema that is constrained by harsh censorship tell us something about the state of sexuality in Iran? The Salesman, I would argue, offers a window into the troubled location of libidinal desires in Iranian society. Farhadi reveals aspects of troubled intimate relations, not by occasionally smuggling clues, but rather by situating sexuality within a seamless web of other social problems that are entangled with it. While one might orient a story around the sexual assault scene, Farhadi nevertheless treats the incident as a purely contingent aspect of his story. As Farhadi frames it, my films are about everyday dramatic realities, extremely simple events that turn into crisis. He called it واقعیت‌های روزمره dramatic. Here is the story in a nutshell. I'm quoting, forced leave their collapsing house. Rana and Ahmad, an Iranian couple who happened to be performers rehearsing the Arthur Miller's Death of a Salesman, rent a new apartment from their fellow performers. Unaware of the fact that the previous tenant had been a woman of ill repute with many clients. They settled down. By a nasty turn of events, one of the clients pays a visit to the apartment one night while Rana is alone at home taking a shower. The aftermath turns the peaceful life of the couple upside down. Now, let us watch the trailer. I hope that it will give us a rough idea. And I hope that we can hear it. Apologies.
زنده این که سیاه همچین گفت خونه خراب شده گفتم از زیر آوار باید بهم بکشونتونه با میگه چه مسئله مستجر قبلیه ما داره بیا بگه چی میدونم اینقدر محکم گفت اما هنگ کردم یا میبرم که سی شانس آوردیم بالاخره شما همینطور Rana. Rana جان. اونو روش کلانتری. والا ما نمیدونیم چی شد. یه مرتبه دیدیم از بالا صدای داد و جیغ اومد. کنارش منتظر تو بودم. از پشت دست کرد تو موام. من فکرم تویی. من چه حالی هم تو بکنی که یه سر فرصت هیچ کاری نکردیم. چی کارش میخوای بکنی؟ یه رو باید پیداش کنم. داری انتقام میگیری ازش. من شکایت هم تو نمیزیم. خود من چی کار کنم؟
All right, so there are two opening sequences with which Farhadi sets the stage for the main story. The first scene is bewildering. It depicts a queen bed with a red blanket. The lighting in the room with a glow on the bed suggests that the mise-en-scène is somehow theatrical. The suggestions turn into an affirmation when the camera frames a spotlight sliding above the scene. Why a private, if not a feminine space? As the opening credits continue, the scene becomes even more alien. The perspective lingers on a wire mesh frame with a motley of neon lights signage, casino, bowling, hotel, bar. The scene seems quite alien to the space of an Iranian film, particularly as it follows the chaotic sequence of the collapsing apartment. The second opening sequence shows that the terrified residents are being asked to evacuate the collapsing building. As the camera walks toward the window, we see a giant excavator working ferociously on the adjacent lot, digging down too close to the foundation of their building. Now, before I continue, let me introduce the characters that concerns my reflection. We have the couple, Rana and Ahmad. They are ordinary middle-class individuals who wish to live a life of peace, a life that could leave them enough space for their penchant for theater and culture. They both work in a theater. Ahmad is also a respected high school teacher. Babak is a theater friend who generously offers his empty flat to the couple as they need to find a new place. And Fushande, or the salesman, is a commoner, a street vendor who also suffers from heart problems. I read the story along two frames, temporal and spatial. Privileging time in the former, the film is structured like a downward spiral of events that plunges its hero into abject moral decadence. The spatial reading takes space as an asynchronous, non-synchronous bearer of traumatic content. What brings the two readings together is that the past in the temporal frame is never fully closed. Thus, its unresolved content lingers within a space. Let us look at the temporal reading as this series of events. She opens the door without asking. She also leaves the entrance door open so that Emad could get in. Emad arrives at the scene and realizes that something terrible has happened. Then the story turns into his attempt in tracking down the sexual perpetrator. So while there is an assumption that events follow each other chronologically, the relationship between past and present is not linear. One can read this story in the following order. One, the apartment that houses the couple needs to be evacuated. Upon recommendation of their theater friend, they move to his humble rooftop flat. A perpetrator enters the flat and enters the bathroom as Rana was taking a shower. While Rana is traumatized by the attack, Emad insists to find the offender, and the story follows. As the story unfolds, nonetheless, we realize that events do not simply progress in a linear fashion. The situation aggravates, and of course, there are incremental accumulative qualities to this aggravation. Yet the relationship between preceding events and their temporal content is not always linear. The second reading, the spatial one, turns to a space as the bearer of social malaise. The film exhibits instances where spaces are libidinally charged. Occupying such spaces or even proximity to them turns individual into a suffering subject. Similar to the first reading, the way a space acts upon the subject is not bound to a sequential formula. Unlike events that emerge out of sequential developments, these spaces can activate their potential abruptly and independently of their events. Now, some examples. We can enumerate situations from the film where an otherwise ordinary location turns into a site of immense distress because it had previously been occupied by someone else with a particular history. One, or A, their building is collapsing, not because, as we would have expected, it is an old building and the foundation is weak. It is crumbling because the neighbor is excavating in an utterly careless and dangerous fashion. To make excavation faster and at a lower cost, the neighbor is causing catastrophic damage at the expense of the adjacent building. The woman that was sitting by Emad in the taxi asked him not to get too close to her, suggesting that Emad is somehow touching her. Here, Emad is being accused of sexual harassment because the woman perhaps had previously been abused by another man. Or here, taking shower in a bathroom that was formerly associated with a different woman, a single mom who was providing sexual favor to clients in exchange for money. What causes agitation has nothing to do with these places or locations per se. They are rather prior memories, experiences, and traumas that foist their negative weight on the situation, transposing their inert violence upon whoever occupies those places. We can list a taxonomy of spatial conditions and their ominous effects: juxtaposition, over proximity, overlap, substitution, conjunction, and so forth. But how does this entanglement work? Something that belongs to the past remains unfinished, which is to say the past is not yet entirely closed. The unresolved latency of the past erupts into the present, imposing its disturbing power. Let me give you a concrete example. When Rana and Ahmad move into the new apartment, they realize that one of the bedrooms is locked. The former tenant has not yet fully evacuated the flat. Babak, the friend who owns the flat, tries to reach out to her, yet she refuses to answer. When Rana uses her own number, the tenant picks up, explaining that she will take care of the furniture in the room as soon as she can find a place. Perhaps a parenthesis here. When Rana suggests that she can pass the phone to Babak, the woman refuses to talk to him. Quote, "I have nothing to discuss with him," end quote. We should ask what has been going on between the woman and Babak. Frustrated with her, Babak decides to break into the room. They moved all what was in the room on the rooftop right outside the door. The symbolism of this displacement is striking. Stuff in the room was moved out, seemingly taken out of the space of the house. But here is the point. They are not entirely outside either. The room is practically empty, but it is not devoid of its content. Similarly, the former tenant has moved out, but her baggage, so to speak, remains inside. We should extend the notion of spatial to bodies, objects, and perhaps voices. The only veritable trace left from the intruder is his bleeding foot. When Ahmad wants to be assured that he is identifying the right person, he asks Frushande to take off his socks. Just as space retains its traumatic content, so too the body holds onto what is marked on its surface. Voices also can function as something that carries through something of the past. Here is the moment when Ahmad realizes that Babak had some extraordinary relationship with the tenant. Perhaps he too was a client. There are objects that play a similar role. Horrified by the incident, the offender forgets to take his car keys. The same goes for the money that he left in the room as the payment to that woman. It seems to me that Farhadi has structured the entire story around this notion of spatial entanglement. Something is left somewhere. This unresolved leftover returns with vengeance. Farhadi once wanted a Western play to be performed by his protagonists in their small theater. But why a Western play? To find an existential play, Farhadi flips through the work of Jean-Paul Sartre, Henrik Ibsen, and Arthur Miller, where he finally finds Miller's Death of a Salesman and describes it as a gift. Interestingly enough, Miller is no stranger to many Iranians. Our very own Professor Yagoubi was teaching Miller's Death of the Salesman in her playwriting class, Namayishname Nevisi, back in Iran. Farhadi incorporates Miller's play as a figure of exchange, not only for the reciprocity of characters or the interplay of events, but mainly because both stories are structured around the theme of humiliation, tahqir. Vili is Miller in Miller's play, and the Frushande in Farhadi's film are both middle-aged men or old men. Both are financially struggling. Both are not respected figures beyond their immediate families, namely their wives. An important scene from Miller's story that takes its way in the theater is the one where the character salesman is caught with a hustler in the hotel room. Both characters cheat on their loyal wives. And of course, Farhadi's choice is strategic. He finds a story to fill in the gaps of his own story while curbing censorship. Farhadi uses scenes from Miller's play to talk about sexuality without showing it. What cannot be explicitly stated has been entrusted to the imported play. Although both characters were involved in extramarital affairs, I would argue that the similarity between the two is a misleading resemblance, a fozami. This immediate connection is less interesting, I think, than the similarities between Ahmad, Farhadi's main character, not Frushande, and the salesman in the Miller's play. What is failing for both characters has nothing to do with sexuality as such, that is their marriage or their sexual relationship it entails. What is at stake rather is their undermined masculinity. More importantly, the theme of humiliation is different from one to the other. Miller's salesman failure has to do with his job. Roughly speaking, he is gradually realizing the fantasy of him being a successful man is falling apart. He can never realize the American dream. For Ahmad, on the other hand, what is humiliating is the notion of male honor, Bayrat. Let us stay with the humiliation for a second. After handing him the money Furushande had left that night, Ahmad ferociously slams the old man. Not perhaps to take revenge, as Rana had given him an ultimatum that he is not allowed to say anything to man's family, but to humiliate him once more. After committing such an inhumane act, Ahmad seeks refuge to the other end of the room and starts crying. Both men are humiliated in each other's humiliation. At the core of masculinity is a desire, not for sex, but for recognition. The male subject imagines his masculinity through a fantasy of being desired. She loves me. The expression functions as a promise of security. The masculine position wishes to be registered within the woman's gaze as the ideal image of masculinity. The subjugation of woman is precisely the attempt of the man to extract an affirmation that holds him up. The irony is that the paradigmatic image of dominations begins at the moment when it submits to the image desired by the feminine subject. Masculinity depends on a constant recognition from a figure that represents all elements from which masculinity needs to distance itself. Yet since there is no inherent essence, as Lacan, Irgare, Butler, etc. says, to femininity, there is no essence to femininity. The man can only rely on an imaginary relationship to the woman, her body and her desire. Masculinity, in other words, desires to be desired by the feminine. The masculine subject desires to subjugate woman's body because the subjugation is the paramount expression of woman's submission to his desire. Yet to be desired as masculine is not coterminous with the body of the woman. Although the masculine desires to be desired, he has no control over this very desire, because desire is not material. It is not an object. Desire can only be accessed as it were through its material expression. Ironically, the more a man tries to force this desire, the more it eludes him. To hide this point of weakness, the masculine has no solution but to hide the woman itself. The obsession with veiling the woman's body, which is evident in all traditional cultures perhaps, is nothing but the symptom of masculinity's constitutive lack. We should ask, what is the directionality of controlling the woman's sexuality? Is it bottom up, emerging from the individual and cultural patriarchal tendencies, or is it top bottom, imposed by a theocratic state? Or perhaps both at one and the same time? But putting the question aside, I want to argue two theses. A, suppression of sexuality does not create a asexual space. It generates a hypersexual space. The entire public domain is obsessed with sexuality. B, when sexuality has to be kept secret, when the public space has to constantly denounce it, the line that separates the public and private would be blurred. In all these scenes, we have both phenomena. Privacy is transgressed. He enters the bedroom because there is no clear understanding where is private and where is public. The content that is kept secret always is sexual. Ahmad, who is a school teacher, one day fell asleep during screening a film in the class. Noticing this, a student started to record a video using his phone. Later, Ahmad snatches the student's phone and probes its gallery. The images were pornographic. As Emma demanded, the students' dad should be called forth and consulted. What renders the obsession with sexuality all the more expected is the fact that the school was a single gender education. You see also the privacy, the transgression of the privacy with her letters and listening to her phone messages. I want to talk about agency of space. Farhadi says, quote, "We draw pleasure from judging and proceed with retributions, punishment based on that judgment. Revenge is the name for this coupling of judgment and punishment," end quote. The precarious content of a location pulls an individual into its vortex. The key distinction resides in the involuntary subjectivation. Because the individual's involvement is somehow unintended, the viewer is left with a dilemma. Who's to blame? It is rather the circumstances that inadvertently turn them into a violent, rather vindictive character. As we can see, something that happened in the past does not disappear. Time is not closed, and that very something pregnant the time and emerges in that space in another moment when another actor occupies that space. But the agency is also shared with the space itself. The content of this leftover is always sexual. Harim, haram, and hormat are etymologically linked. Woman's body translates into a space. Fatima Mernisi argues that patriarchy postulates the veil as a means of privatizing of woman's sexuality, colonizing woman's body to the interiority of harem or haram. The haram, I'm quoting her, the haram is both the place and the woman who lives in it. And this confusion between place and beings is absolutely central to all Muslim architecture. She continues, the haram is a protected space, and a man may kill in order to deny access to it. The duty of ulama is to keep watch over thresholds and to remind us that Islam is nothing but this, respect for hudud, non-violation of thresholds and boundaries.
Ehsan.
Yes.
Sorry to interrupt. Do you mind please wrapping up so we can have some time for Q&A?
Sure. Am I at my 20 minutes?
Yes.
Okay. So I want to also argue that, we have this theme of incomplete modernization in this film, and nobody says it better than Dariush Shaigan when he says, "My consciousness is still rooted in a world of enchantment. I do not calculate in terms of centuries. I tend to scramble the order of centuries because the qualitative distinctions which punctuate Western history have not concrete representation in my mind." Now, to wrap up, although I shouldn't be at my 20 minutes, but I just wanted to say this scene is interesting because you will see that Ahmad throws food out to a trash of food because he thinks that Rana has used the money that has been left in the apartment by the perpetrator. So this is a cinema that talks about incomplete modernity. And interesting enough, Dariush Mehjui film is the one that Ahmad shows to his students. I had some things about Me Too movement, but it seems that I'm running out of time. So to wrap up, really, my argument is that time is unfinished. Then something that is times haunts the space. And all of this happens because transparency doesn't exist, because we have to close certain things. And this is the result of the effect of prohibition of sexuality. I will end with this line. While the camera is not immediately focused on sexual relations, the scene of frustrated libidinal desires are nevertheless in sharp focus. The total suppression of sexual desires and representations turns these unfulfilled desires into pathologies, haunting the entire social field. A well-articulated line of thought in psychoanalysis shows that there is a negative correlation between prohibition and desire. When sexuality is prohibited, everything becomes sexual. A deeper reading nonetheless suggests that what appears to be the return of the repressed of sexual desires has nothing to do with the sexuality itself. And I appreciate Farhadi's cinema because it's cinema that doesn't provide answers but raises the question. And we cannot have a symposium about Iran without poetry. So I smuggle in a line from Hafez that says, "پاسبان حرم دل شدم شب همه شب تا در این پرده جز اندیشه او نگذارم." What we see here in this film is the demise of the intimate domain. With blurring the line between the private and the public, we can no longer believe in the guardian of the sanctuary of heart. Thank you very much. Apologies, Rustin John.
Thank you, Ehsan. Those are our fascinating papers. I want to invite all of the panelists to come on for a quick Q&A. Thank you very much for a very interdisciplinary and lively set of papers, and I really hope that we have some great questions for everyone in the chat. So we have two questions. Like I said before, please feel free to write in the chat and to address it to our panelists individually. So Mehrdad Babadi says, this is a question for Leila. Thank you so much for presenting an interesting paper. Does your research include Iranian men and their interracial partnership with members of the host societies? Are there differences between the way men are perceived, understood, and treated compared to Iranian women in the US? How different are the problems of integration for both genders when it comes to romantic and marital relationships? Any insights would be appreciated. Thank you. And before Leila, you answer that question, I just want to read Ehsan's question as well. Question for Ehsan. This is from Alexander Japari. Thank you for your talk. Could you say something about the site of the theater in the film? It seems like there was another space that would be fruitful for your analysis, where the lines between public and private are blurred. So please, Leila, appreciate your response.
Thank you, Rustin. And thank you, Mehrdad, for this wonderful question. I hate to disappoint, but interestingly enough, as I mentioned, I've looked over 60 something works of Iranian diasporic literature, and overwhelmingly they're written by women. And I don't know if I was drawn to those works or that was just how it was. I honestly, the only thing that comes to my mind where there's an interracial marriage between an Iranian man and a white woman, unfortunately, is Not Without My Daughter, written by Betty Mahmoudi, which is honestly an awful book, but I don't know, that's just me. It's interesting because in that particular book and the adapted movie, there's a lot of focus on like the macho man and the aggression that comes from a Middle Eastern man being in a relationship and stuff like that. And none of that is reflected in the novels that I've read, quite possibly because it's in the voice of these women who are within in these relationships. And the only thing that was pronounced was the fact that Iranian women were exoticized in the eyes of the white man. But I will definitely look into the literature more to see if there's any, like, I don't want to say the reverse, but the other, what's the word? If there's another way of talking about these things. Thank you.
Ehsan, please.
Yes, thank you for the question. I think this is a very good question because it opens the door for us asking again, why a Western play in the first place? And what Farhadi is trying to signal through that? Is he trying to say Iranians are interested in Western plays, or we are modern enough to have, Western play as a very normal thing in our lives. One reading is that to say this is, these are people, educated people teaching in a school. And interesting enough, the books that he suggests to students, the principal of a school rejects his recommended books. So meaning that he brought some canonical Western literature for his class and the principal rejects that. So we have really a question that's hard to answer about the relationship of this insertion of a Western play into the space of the film. I don't know if I'm answering the question, but that's one way.
Great. There's a few more questions here. I will probably read them out loud, all at once. So 2 questions for Leila. What are your thoughts to fetishization of exotic foreign minority women still prevalent today on any sort of level, casual, societal, cultural, and etc.? And that's by Audrey. And we have an anonymous attendee who asks, can Leila please elaborate on when she was saying browning rather than whitening of Iranian American identities in the diaspora? As a member of the Iranian diaspora who grew up in the heart of Tehran in the late 90s and early 2000s, I never felt the divide until adulthood. And I would be interested to see who is saying that about this browning taking place, where and when. Thank you so much. And so I would just read one more question. This is to all the speakers. It says, thank you for and this is from Zara. Thank you for your papers. Most papers looked at what seemed like a predominantly heteronormative desire and experiences. In talking about transgressions, I'm wondering where the space is to talk about non-normative sexualities, whether in literature or film, either as gesture or literally.
I would love to take a stab at these questions. Thank you so much for the questions. Audrey, I'm looking at you right now. Honestly, I don't have many thoughts on this, but this is something that as a minority woman of color, I do, tackle with this. And I do know that this is a really, it's a problem. It's a trouble. It's something that whenever I'm in a space that I'm the only person of color or the only person from like a non-native, an immigrant community, whenever I'm the only person there, everyone's like, ooh, do you eat with utensils? Do you have roads in your country and stuff like that? And not only the women are exoticized, but also the experiences and the beings are exoticized. So yeah, those are my thoughts. We need to tackle these things and help normalize otherness and not actually talk about otherness in that sense. About the browning rather than whitening, this is what Neda Maqbooleh has theorized in her dissertation that came out as a book called The Limits of Whiteness in 2017. It's a fascinating book. She interviewed a lot of Iranian American youth that more specifically were attending Camp Ayanda and Camp Farda by the IAB group, Iranian American Alliance Cross Borders, if I'm not mistaken. So these are the Iranian American youth who have been mostly born here and raised here. And a lot of these youth that we're talking about identifying with the marker person of color instead of being legally white was because they didn't have access to Tehranjalis and the Iranian American community. So there weren't many people they could really associate with. So this is taking place and has been heightened in the post 9/11 era, where a lot of the Iranian American and Middle Eastern labels were created or disseminated even more. So I hope I answered those questions.
And yes, so then there's the question that Zara asked. And then I do have, there is another question for James. I just want to make sure that I read it. This is by another anonymous attendee. And it says, James, you mentioned children of intermarriage feeling like they do not belong in either world. Has your research or just your personal knowledge ever crossed children of minorities, adoptees, or mixed Asian heritage as well? I know of friends like that, like this, who also feel like they are not part of quote unquote either world.
Thank you for the question. I'll just start with Zara's question because I think it's an important one, just briefly. One of the limitations of the research, or from many people doing research in Iran, is you always have to be careful about what topics you're covering. I'll be honest and say that the research I've done on this topic in particular has been entirely heteronormative, and that is because of not wanting to stick my head out. I guess it's a cowardly answer, but that is the case. Though I will add, just as an interesting aside, and this is entirely anecdotal, I did meet an Iranian Jewish man who was a gay man, and he was in a same-sex relationship with another man, also Iranian, but not of Jewish background. And one of the interesting things he told me was that if, in his experience, his parents almost didn't consider him to be, they didn't see it as a problem that he was with someone of another gender because, another background, because he wasn't going to have children in the community anyway. So that's an anecdotal response, but I thought I'd just mention it as best I could answer your question. With regard to the anonymous question, yes, I have. And actually, one of my colleagues, Jessica Walton, who's from the United States, but she was from she was a Korean adoptee, and she was raised by a white American family in Virginia. She has done a lot of research on this topic, and she's actually one of my neighbors as well. So my conversations with her, she has talked a lot about this, and also it's very true. It's filled me in on a lot of the issues to feeling out of place or not quite in one place or another, which is not that uncommon an experience for many people, but it's felt acutely by people in that situation. Also, another scholar in Australia, Caitlin Nunn, has worked on this as well. She's done some interesting work she's looked at it from a different angle, children of Vietnamese migrants who for those people who are familiar with Australia, Vietnamese Australians are almost like very archetypally Australian, the stereotypical sense in their behaviour, but because of racial difference, they're racialised. So talking about being very Australian, not at all Vietnamese, but then being excluded because of racial reasons and never feeling entirely Australian. Another good person to follow up if anyone's interested is she's a journalist and a cultural critic named Ming Cavanaugh. She's Irish. She's from County Kerry. She's what we call Walgor, an native Irish speaker. And she wrote a very interesting book called Ansho, which means here. It's available in English. She was born of she's a Vietnamese adoptee, adopted into an Irish-speaking family in Ireland. And her whole experience, like if you follow her on Twitter, which I strongly recommend that you do, she's constantly being abused by nationalists, saying you're not truly Irish. And also those who have a very, I guess they say condescending view of like, oh, it's so good to see see Asian people speak our language, which is, a very condescending thing to say. But she herself is very much a strong cultural critic on this topic. And she's very adamant that Vietnam is the circumstances of her birth, and that she sees herself as an Irish person and everything about her is Irish. But she has constantly been fed this view from people everywhere that no, you don't belong either. So it's a very interesting question, and I think I've given you more of a discussion than an answer, but thank you again.
Everyone, I know that we have two questions left by Shahrzad and by Turkce. Sadly, we are over time. As my moderator, I failed to keep everyone under 6:30, but I figured for 7 minutes for some good questions, that's totally fine. So I apologize to Claudia and Emma and everybody else, but for Shahrzad and Turkce, your questions, if you would like the answers to these questions, I recommend please emailing all of us or emailing Leila or James or Ehsan. And we would love to continue the conversation in a different format. But I know it's Saturday, some dinner time for most people on EST. And so I would like everybody I just want to thank everybody for coming to this wonderful panel. And I would like to thank our panelists, Ehsan, James, and Leila, and also for Emma and Claudia for organizing this, and for Claudia for organizing this, and for Emma for making all of this happen technically and virtually. And I just want to say thank you very much. And please come to the next panel. And the information is available on the social media pages and the pages of the UNC Center for Middle Eastern Studies. And yeah, I would just like to say thank you very much, and enjoy the rest of your evening or morning for James, I guess. So
thank you, everyone, and thank you, Claudia, again, and thank you, Rustin, for moderating.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good day.